I spent my life savings to bring him here from Africa, only to catch his real plan through a PlayStation headset. On today's episode of the WANDERER'S Tales, we dive where quiet courage prevails. Hidden truths and hearts so bold, stories of fear left untold. If this calls to you, don't delay, subscribe, tap the bell and stay with us, thank you. The fluorescent lights of the oncology ward had a way of stripping the soul bare, casting a clinical, unforgiving pallor over everything they touched. Naga moved through the corridors with the practiced grace of a woman who had spent a decade negotiating with death, her rubber clogs squeaking rhythmically against the polished linoleum. It was 3:00 a.m., the dead hour, when the world outside was a silent void and the only reality was the rhythmic hiss of ventilators and the occasional, lonely beep of an IV pump. Her hands, calloused from years of sanitizing and gloving, found a moment of stillness at the nursing station. She didn't reach for water or caffeine. She reached for the glowing rectangle of her smartphone. The screen illuminated her face, highlighting the deep-seated weariness in her eyes, but as she swiped through the notifications, a soft, involuntary smile tugged at her lips. There he was, Kofi, a digital ghost who felt more real than the dying patients in room 412. His messages were a lifeline, a vibrant tapestry of "Good morning, my queen, and I am dreaming of our future," that bridged the 6,000-mile gap between Houston's humid nights and the rising sun of Accra. For Naga, a woman who gave everything of herself to the broken and the fatting, Kofi was the only thing that felt like it was growing. He was her secret garden, a place where she wasn't just a caregiver, but a woman deserving of a kingdom. The addiction had started small, a stray comment on a travel blog, a private message that blossomed into a 1,000-page digital diary. Kofi was everything the local men weren't: patient, poetic, and seemingly unburdened by the cynical transactionalism of American dating. He spoke of the red dust of Ghana, of the salt spray of the Atlantic, and of a traditional devotion that promised to anchor Naga's drifting heart. As she sat in the stillness of the hospital, the sounds of the city outside, the distant hum of the I-10, and the siren of a passing ambulance faded into the background. She was no longer a 34-year-old nurse whose back ached and whose social life was a graveyard of missed connections. In the blue light of her phone, she was a protagonist in a grand, cross-continental romance. She didn't see the red flags in his constant need for validation, or the way he subtly steered every conversation toward the impossibility of his current circumstances. She only saw the man who sent her voice notes of high-life music and told her that her beauty was a light that could guide ships home. She didn't know then that the light he saw in her wasn't her spirit, but the glow of her bank account and the power of her blue passport. To Naga, this was destiny. To Kofi, it was the first move in a very long, very profitable game of chess. The heat of Accra didn't just hit Naga when she stepped off the plane. It embraced her like a heavy, spice-scented blanket, thick with the smell of exhaust, sea salt, and burning wood. It was her first time on the continent, a pilgrimage of the heart funded by 3 months of grueling double shifts and the sale of her grandmother's gold jewelry. She stood in the terminal of Kotoka International Airport, her hair humidity-frizzed, and her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. When she saw him, the digital image finally snapping into three-dimensional reality, the breath left her lungs. Kofi was more handsome than the pixels had promised, tall, with skin the color of dark mahogany and a smile that seemed to capture all the sunlight of the equator. He held a bouquet of wilted tropical flowers and moved toward her with a confidence that made the chaotic airport around them vanish. When he wrapped his arms around her, whispering, "You are home, my wife," into her ear, the last of Naga's defenses crumbled. She didn't feel like a tourist. She felt like a missing piece of a puzzle finally clicking into place. The taxi ride through the city was a kaleidoscopic blur of vibrant market stalls, yellow and blue trotros, and the constant, rhythmic honking of horns that felt like the heartbeat of a world she had been denied for too long. For the next 2 weeks, Kofi curated a version of Africa that was designed to enchant. He took her to the mist-covered canopy of Kakum, where they walked high above the forest floor, and to the somber, whitewashed walls of Elmina Castle, where they wept together over the ghosts of the past. Every meal was a ceremony, every sunset a promise. Kofi moved through the city with an effortless charisma, introducing Naga to business partners and old friends, who all looked at her with a mixture of reverence and something she couldn't quite name. Was it envy, or was it a secret shared between them? He lived in a modest but clean apartment in East Legon, a space he claimed was all he could afford while building his dream. He spoke of his struggles with a dignity that broke Naga's heart, detailing the corruption that had stalled his tech startup and the family obligations that kept him tethered to the ground. She watched him interact with the street vendors and the neighborhood children, his kindness appearing boundless. She saw a man of character, a man who just needed a fair chance in a world that had been unfair to him. She didn't notice how he never let her pay for small things in public, but managed to be short on cash every time a major bill arrived at the apartment. She was too busy falling in love with the mirage he had built, a shimmering oasis in the desert of her loneliness. The journey from the urban sprawl of Accra to the ancestral village was a bone-rattling odyssey through a landscape that felt increasingly ancient and untouchable. Naga sat in the passenger seat of a weathered Toyota, her fingers interlaced with Kofi, watching the vibrant city concrete dissolve into the emerald chaos of the bush. The red dust of the unpaved roads rose in thick, choking plumes, coating the windows in a fine ochre powder that blurred the world outside into a series of impressionistic smears. Kofi spoke in low, reverent tones about his upbringing, painting a picture of a childhood defined by communal love and the steady, guiding hand of his mother, the woman he called the Anyame of his life. As they pulled into the clearing of the family compound, the air was heavy with the scent of wood smoke and fermenting cassava. A group of women in faded but impeccably clean wax-print fabrics emerged, their voices rising in a rhythmic, high-pitched greeting that made Naga feel like royalty returning from exile. At the center of it all sat the matriarch, a woman whose face was a beautiful map of etched lines, and whose eyes held a depth of wisdom that felt both welcoming and terrifyingly observant. Kofi knelt before her, and Naga, moved by the sheer gravity of the moment, followed suit. When the old woman placed a cool, dry hand on Naga's forehead and whispered a blessing in a language Naga didn't understand, the American nurse felt a profound sense of belonging. She didn't see the fleeting, sharp look exchanged between Kofi and his mother, a look that wasn't of parental pride, but of professional acknowledgement, the way a fisherman might look at a peer who has finally hooked a prize-winning marlin. The evening was a masterclass in emotional manipulation, disguised as a traditional welcome feast. Under the flickering light of kerosene lamps and the silver glow of a crescent moon, Naga was fed until she was breathless. Bowls of rich, spicy light soup, balls of pounded fufu that felt like heavy silk, and grilled tilapia seasoned with herbs she couldn't name. Kofi's family sat around them, regaling Naga with stories of Kofi's supposed brilliance, his legendary selflessness, and the tragedy of his father's lost legacy. They spoke of a man who had sacrificed his own education to pay for his siblings' schooling, a man who was the pillar of a community that was slowly crumbling under the weight of economic hardship. Every story was a thread in a net, weaving tighter and tighter around Naga's heart. By the time the matriarch took Naga's hands in hers, and with tears shimmering in her eyes, thanked her for saving her son from the despair that had started to claim him, Naga was completely ensnared. She saw herself not just as a girlfriend, but as a savior, a provider, and the chosen daughter of an honorable lineage. She felt a surge of protective instinct so fierce it blinded her to the reality of the compound. The way the siblings seemed to eye her designer handbag with a calculating coldness. Or how the dilapidated family home featured a brand new satellite dish hidden discreetly behind a baobab tree. To Naga, this was the real Africa she had come to find, an unfiltered experience of love and tradition that she felt privileged to fund, never realizing she was paying for the very stage upon which this elaborate play was being performed. The transition from the blissful isolation of the village back to the humid reality of Accra was marked by a sudden, jarring shift in the atmosphere. It happened on their final night in the city, in the quiet, shadowed corner of a high-end rooftop bar overlooking the glittering lights of Asu. Kofi, who had been the embodiment of joy for 2 weeks, was suddenly withdrawn, his eyes fixed on the horizon with a look of haunted desperation. When Naga pressed him, he initially resisted, playing the role of the proud man who refused to burden his woman with his troubles. But as the night wore on and the cocktails flowed, the dam finally broke. He spoke of a catastrophic development with his tech startup, a sudden, predatory legal claim from a corrupt government official who was demanding a settlement to release Kofi's equipment from the port. He described it as the final hurdle, the one thing standing between him and the life of independence he wanted to build for them. He spoke with such raw, trembling vulnerability that Naga felt a physical ache in her chest. She saw the man she loved on the verge of losing everything he had worked for, and in that moment, the thousands of dollars she had saved for her own mortgage felt like an insignificant sacrifice compared to his future. She was the one who suggested the loan, practically begging him to let her help, while he performed a heart-wrenching dance of refusal before finally succumbing to her generosity with a shower of grateful tears. The transaction was the first real crack in the foundation of their relationship, though Naga saw it as a strengthening of their bond. The process of transferring the money, a sum that represented a year of her life's work, felt transactional and cold compared to the heat of their romance, but Kofi's reaction made it feel like a holy act. He promised her, with a fervency that bordered on the religious, that every cent would be returned tenfold once they were settled in America. He began to talk more frequently about the blue passport as a tool of liberation, not just for him, but for their future children. He crafted a narrative where the United States was the forge and he was the iron, and Naga was the fire that would make him strong. However, in the days following the transfer, a subtle change began to take hold. The business crisis had been resolved, but the intimacy they had shared in the village started to feel performative. Kofi was often on his phone, claiming to be closing the loops on his affairs, his laughter echoing in the other room as he spoke in rapid-fire Ga or Twi. When Naga would enter, the conversation would abruptly end, replaced by a quick, distracting kiss and a compliment about her beauty. The slow build of the scam was entering its secondary phase, the phase of dependency. Naga was no longer just a lover. She was an investor, and like any investor, she was now tethered to the success of the project, which meant she was tethered to him. Returning to Houston was like waking up from a vivid, technicolor dream into a world of gray, clinical reality. The oncology ward felt more oppressive than ever, the silence of her suburban home echoing with the absence of the man she had left behind. But the physical distance was quickly bridged by the digital chains of modern technology. Their relationship transitioned into a 24-hour cycle of WhatsApp calls, FaceTime dates, and endless streams of voice notes. Naga found herself living in 2 time zones, her internal clock permanently set to GMT. She would finish a grueling 12-hour shift, her body screaming for sleep, only to stay awake for another 4 hours because it was morning in Accra and Kofi needed to talk. The psychological toll was immense. She was becoming a ghost in her own life, her conversations with friends and family becoming shorter and more distracted as she constantly checked her phone for the ping that signaled his presence. Kofi mastered the art of intermittent reinforcement, showering her with intense affection one day and becoming mysteriously busy or melancholy the next. This created a powerful addictive loop in Naga's brain. The highs of his attention were so intoxicating that she would do anything to avoid the lows of his silence. She began to view her life in Houston merely as a mechanism to generate the resources needed to bring him home, her identity as a nurse becoming secondary to her role as the architect of his migration. As the months dragged on, the financial requests became more frequent, though they were always framed as essential steps for the visa process. There were fees for medical exams that seemed suspiciously expensive, expedite charges for police clearances, and the constant background hum of family emergencies. Kofi's mother had a fainting spell. His younger sister needed tuition assistance to avoid being kicked out of school. Naga, fueled by the memory of the matriarch's blessing and the loan she had already provided, felt she couldn't stop now. To stop was to admit that the initial investment was a mistake, a psychological phenomenon known as the sunk cost fallacy that Kofi exploited with surgical precision. He began to use guilt as a subtle weapon, lamenting how ashamed he felt to be a man who couldn't provide for his woman, which invariably led to Naga reassuring him by sending more money. She was working 60 hours a week now, her face drawn and her skin sallow from lack of sunlight and nutrition. Her coworkers noticed the change, the way she stopped joining them for lunch, the way she seemed to be constantly calculating something on a scratch pad. But Naga brushed off their concerns, convinced that they simply didn't understand the depth of an African love. She was building a kingdom, she told herself, unaware that she was merely building a gold-plated bridge for a man who intended to walk over her to get to the other side. The visa process became a sprawling, bureaucratic monster that ate Naga's time and sanity. She became an expert on K-1 fiancé visas, navigating the labyrinthine requirements of the Department of State with the focus of a woman possessed. Every document, every form, every affidavit of support was a testament to her devotion. She had to prove their relationship was bona fide, a task she approached by creating a massive, leather-bound scrapbook filled with printed chat logs, photos from her trip to Ghana, and receipts for every wire transfer she had ever sent. To the immigration officers, it was evidence. To Naga, it was the scripture of her soul. The irony was that the very transparency required by the law was the tool Kofi used to sharpen his deception. He coached her on what to say, which photos to prioritize, and how to frame their love story to ensure the quickest approval. He was a shadow editor of their reality, ensuring that the paper trail looked like a fairy tale. Meanwhile, back in Houston, Naga's bank accounts were bleeding out. The legal fees, the filing fees, and the cost of the pre-wedding gifts she sent to his family were hollowed out her savings. She even dipped into her 401k, convincing herself that she was investing in their future rather than mortgaging her own. The day the visa interview was scheduled in Accra felt like the climax of a thriller. Naga stayed up all night, her phone propped up on her pillow as she waited for the call from Kofi. She could hear the ambient noise of the embassy waiting room through the speaker, the low murmur of hopeful voices, the shuffle of papers, the distant bark of a security guard. When Kofi finally emerged, his voice cracking with emotion as he told her the visa had been granted, Naga collapsed into tears of pure, unadulterated relief. She felt as though she had won a war. In her mind, the struggle was over. The scam of the world had tried to keep them apart, and her love had triumphed. She immediately booked a premium economy ticket for him. She wanted his first experience of the West to be one of comfort and dignity. She spent the following week preparing her house, turning the guest room into a media room, and stocking the pantry with Ghanaian spices she found at a specialty market in North Houston. She bought him a new wardrobe, imagining how handsome he would look in the tailored suits and designer sneakers she had picked out. She was so focused on the logistics of his arrival that she failed to notice the subtle shift in his tone during their final calls from Ghana. He wasn't talking about their future anymore. He was asking very specific questions about the layout of her house, the proximity of the nearest African community hubs, and whether she had set up the joint account yet. Kofi's final days in Accra were a whirlwind of carefully choreographed farewells. He organized a leaving party at a trendy lounge in Labadi, a celebration that Naga funded from 3,000 miles away. In the videos he sent her, he looked like a king among men, surrounded by friends who toasted to his success and his blessed union. Naga watched these clips on her break at the hospital, her heart swelling with pride. She saw a man who was loved and respected, a man who was leaving everything behind for her. What she didn't see was the conversation Kofi had in the VIP section with a sleek, beautiful woman named Amma, the woman the village matriarch actually called daughter-in-law. Amma was the real architect, the one who had helped Kofi draft the initial messages and who had coached the family on their roles. To them, Naga wasn't a person. She was a project, a lucrative contract that was finally reaching its fulfillment phase. Kofi's departure wasn't a sacrifice. It was a deployment. He promised Amma under the cover of the pounding Afrobeat music that the final score was within reach. He told her to be patient, that the American nurse was already broken in, and that once he secured his permanent status and the big payout, he would bring Amma over as his sister to complete the play. The airport scene in Accra was a masterpiece of performance art. Kofi arrived at Kotoka with a single suitcase, looking every bit the humble traveler. He recorded a final voice note for Naga as he walked toward the gate, his voice thick with a feigned, tremulous fear of the unknown. "I am leaving my soul behind in this soil, Naga," he whispered, "but I am bringing my heart to you. Pray for me." As he boarded the plane, he felt no remorse, only a cold, vibrating sense of ambition. He watched the coastline of Ghana disappear beneath the clouds, not with the sadness of an emigrant, but with the cold calculation of a predator moving to a more fertile hunting ground. He spent the long flight across the Atlantic studying the husband role he would need to play, reviewing the details of Naga's life he had memorized to ensure no slips occurred. He knew her schedule, her weaknesses, her deepest insecurities, and her favorite romantic gestures. By the time the plane began its descent into the humid heat of Houston, Kofi had completely shed his Ghanaian identity. He was now the devoted fiancé, the grateful immigrant, and the future American success story. He adjusted his collar in the airplane lavatory, practiced his overwhelmed expression in the mirror, and prepared to step into the life Naga had so meticulously and expensively built for him. The sliding glass doors of the international arrivals terminal at George Bush Intercontinental Airport felt like the gates of a new reality. Naga stood behind the metal barricade, her heart hammering so hard she felt lightheaded. She was wearing the dress he had once complimented in a photo, her hair done with a precision that belied her exhaustion. When he finally appeared, pushing a luggage cart that looked far too light for a man moving across the world seemed to slow down. He looked thinner in the harsh, sterile light of the terminal, more vulnerable than he had appeared on camera. When their eyes met, Kofi dropped the handle of the cart and broke into a run, sweeping Naga off her feet in a cinematic embrace that drew smiles from the weary travelers passing by. He buried his face in her neck, and Naga felt his body shaking. She assumed it was with the weight of the moment, the sheer relief of finally being together. "I'm here," he sobbed, a sound that tore through Naga's last remaining doubts. "I'm finally here, my queen." She held him as if he were made of glass, whispering that he was safe, that they were finally starting their life. The drive home was a blur of neon signs and freeway overpasses, Kofi staring out the window with a look of wide-eyed wonder that Naga found incredibly endearing. The first night in their matrimonial bed was a strange mixture of intense intimacy and a lingering, ghostly awkwardness. Naga had decorated the room with candles and fresh linens, wanting the night to be a sacred initiation into their shared life. Kofi was a gentle, attentive lover, but there was a quality to his presence that felt almost too perfect, as if he were following a script of how a grateful, devoted man should behave. He spoke in whispers about the luxury of her home, the softness of the carpet, and the miracle of the central air conditioning. He made Naga feel like she had rescued him from a life of unimaginable hardship, which in turn made her feel a godlike sense of power and responsibility. As he eventually fell asleep in her arms, Naga lay awake for hours, watching the shadows of the ceiling fan dance across the walls. She felt a profound sense of accomplishment. She had done it. She had navigated the bureaucracy, the finances, and the distance. She looked at the man sleeping beside her and saw a blank canvas upon which she could paint her perfect life. She didn't notice that even in sleep, Kofi's hand remained firmly gripped around his smartphone, tucked securely under his pillow. She didn't know that while she was dreaming of wedding colors and baby names, he was already mentally cataloging the value of the electronics in her living room and calculating how long he would have to stay married before he could claim his independence. In the weeks that followed, Naga's Houston home transformed into a gilded cage for Kofi's new American identity. She spared no expense in ensuring he felt like a king. She took him on a shopping spree at the Galleria, replacing his worn Ghanaian clothes with high-end denim, silk blend shirts, and European sneakers. She bought him a used but pristine BMW, telling him that a man of his stature shouldn't have to rely on public transit in a city like Houston. To the outside world, they were the ultimate success story, a beautiful, hard-working nurse and her handsome, ambitious African fiancé. Naga's social media became a curated gallery of their firsts: his first Texas brisket, his first trip to the Gulf Coast, his first American 4th of July. The comments from her friends were a mixture of goals. "And you deserve this, Naga." She bathed in the validation, using it to drown out the quiet, nagging voice in the back of her mind that noticed how Kofi never seemed to reach for his wallet, even for a coffee, or how he spent hours every day in the bathroom with the door locked, the low murmur of his voice echoing against the tile. Kofi's adaptation to American life was unnervingly fast. He moved from awe to expectation within a month. He began to express subtle dissatisfaction with the limitations of her neighborhood, hinting that they should look into moving to a more vibrant part of the city once he started his business. He was a master of the soft demand, making Naga feel that providing for him was a privilege. He began to develop a delicate constitution, claiming that the American food was upsetting his system, and that he needed expensive organic supplements and specific, imported ingredients. Naga, ever the nurse, was happy to oblige, her caretaking instincts overriding her common sense. She was working more than ever now to fund this new, elevated lifestyle, taking on extra weekend shifts and holiday pay opportunities. The more she worked, the more Kofi was left alone in the house, a dynamic he exploited to the fullest. He was building his own digital world within the walls she paid for, a world where Naga was nothing more than a sponsor and a resource. He would spend his afternoons at the local gym, using the membership she paid for to network with other West African expats, slowly building a support system that Naga knew nothing about. He was a ghost in her house, a man who occupied the space but left no emotional footprint, save for the one he carefully manufactured for her when she returned home from work. The peak of their honeymoon phase was marked by a lavish, unofficial wedding ceremony they held in her backyard for a small circle of friends. It wasn't legally binding. They were waiting for the formal courthouse date. But to Naga, it was the real thing. She wore a white lace dress that cost more than 2 of her mortgage payments, and Kofi wore a traditional kente cloth wrap over a modern suit, a visual representation of their blended future. The photos were breathtaking, capturing a look of such profound devotion on Kofi's face that Naga's skeptical best friend, Sarah, finally admitted she might have been wrong about him. "He looks at you like you're the son, Naga," Sarah whispered during the reception. Naga beamed, her heart overflowing. For a few glorious weeks, the deception was so perfect that even Kofi seemed to believe it. He was the perfect husband, helping with the cooking, surprising her with flowers, and listening with rapt attention as she vented about the stresses of the oncology ward. It was a period of high-definition romance, a cinematic montage of love that served as the ultimate distraction from the rot spreading beneath the surface. However, the honeymoon was also the period where the financial boundaries disappeared entirely. Now that they were married in the eyes of their community, Kofi suggested they consolidate their finances for efficiency. He argued that as the head of the household, he needed to understand their capital so he could begin investing in the U.S. branch of his tech startup. Naga, caught in the afterglow of their ceremony, added him to her primary checking and savings accounts. She saw it as an act of ultimate trust. He saw it as the keys to the vault. Almost immediately, the spending patterns changed. Large ATM withdrawals began to appear, always explained away as startup costs or securing vendors. When Naga would gently question him, he would turn it into a conversation about her lack of faith in his vision, using the emotional currency he had built during the honeymoon to silence her. He began to isolate her from her friends, subtly suggesting that Sarah was jealous of their happiness, or that her family didn't respect African culture. He was narrowing her world until he was the only source of truth and validation she had left. The power couple facade remained intact on Instagram, but inside the house, the atmosphere was becoming heavy with an unspoken, vibrating tension. As the novelty of his arrival began to fade, a new and chilling phase of the scam emerged, the language of silence. Kofi began to weaponize his culture shock, using it as a blanket excuse for a growing emotional distance. He would spend entire evenings staring out the window, refusing to speak, claiming he was homesick or overwhelmed by the pace of the West. When Naga tried to comfort him, he would pull away, suggesting that she could never truly understand the burden of the immigrant. This created a profound sense of guilt in Naga. She felt responsible for his unhappiness, as if her love wasn't enough to compensate for what he had left behind. The physical intimacy that had been so vibrant during the first month became sporadic and mechanical. He began to sleep on the far edge of the bed, his back turned to her, the blue light of his phone illuminating his face until the early hours of the morning. When she asked who he was talking to, his answer was always the same: "My mother," or "the boys back home." He was gaslighting her with her own empathy, using her respect for his culture as a shield to hide his increasing detachment. The silence wasn't just verbal, it was a withdrawal of the Kofi she had fallen in love with. The poetic, patient man from the WhatsApp messages was being replaced by a cold, irritable stranger who seemed annoyed by her very presence. He began to criticize her, the way she dressed, the way she spoke, the stress she brought home from the hospital. He made her feel small in her own home, a host who was failing to provide a suitable environment for her guest. Naga found herself walking on eggshells, constantly trying to fix his mood with gifts, gourmet meals, and more money. She was desperate to return to the honeymoon, not realizing that the honeymoon had been a tactical deployment of charm, designed to reach the stage of total financial and emotional control. She started to feel like a ghost in her own house, a provider who was only acknowledged when the bills were due or when the fridge was empty. The psychological erosion was nearly complete. Naga was so focused on saving the relationship that she didn't have the mental energy to see the man standing right in front of her. The breaking point of their domestic routine came when Naga, in a desperate attempt to bridge the growing gap between them, bought Kofi a PlayStation 5. She saw it as a gift of distraction, a way for him to connect with his friends back in Ghana and find some joy in his isolation. She spent nearly $1,000 on the console, the extra controllers, and a high-end headset, imagining him laughing and gaming while she worked her night shifts. When she presented it to him, Kofi's reaction was the first flash of genuine excitement she had seen in weeks. He kissed her with a fervor that felt like a return to the old days, calling her his provider and his angel. Naga felt a surge of hope. Maybe this was all he needed, a little piece of home, a way to blow off steam. She set it up in their bedroom, on a large TV she had also purchased for him, thinking it would be a shared space of relaxation. Instead, the PlayStation became the final wall between them. Kofi became obsessed, his nocturnal energy finding a new outlet in the world of online gaming. He would put on the noise-canceling headset the moment Naga arrived home from work, effectively tuning her out of existence. He joined parties, online chat groups with other players, where he spoke in rapid-fire Ga, his voice loud and animated in a way it never was with her. Naga would lie in bed beside him, the room bathed in the flickering blue light of the screen, the rhythmic clicking of the controller, and the aggressive trash talk of the games replacing the sounds of their intimacy. She felt more alone with him in the room than she had when he was 6,000 miles away. She convinced herself that this was just a phase, a man thing, and that she should be happy he was finally happy. She didn't realize that the parties he was joining weren't just for gaming. He was using the PlayStation's chat network because it was a dark channel, a place where Naga wouldn't think to look, and where he could speak freely to the people who truly mattered to him. The gift she had bought to save their marriage was actually the tool he would use to destroy her. The rhythm of Naga's life had been subsumed by a perpetual, exhausting twilight, a state of being where the boundaries between her grueling shifts at the oncology ward and her increasingly alien home life had completely dissolved. She existed in a state of high-functioning somnambulism, her body moving through the motions of checking vitals and administering chemotherapy, while her mind was perpetually anchored to the flickering blue light of her bedroom back in the suburbs. Kofi had become a creature of the night, a digital vampire who thrived in the hours when the rest of the world slept, his obsession with the PlayStation 5 evolving from a hobby into a wall of impenetrable sound and fury. Every evening, Naga would return home to find the curtains drawn tight against the Houston sun, the air stale with the smell of takeout and the low, vibrating hum of the console's cooling fan. Kofi would be perched on the edge of their expensive, silk-sheeted bed, the noise-canceling headset a physical manifestation of his withdrawal from her reality. He no longer looked at her when she entered. His eyes were locked on the screen, reflecting the chaotic explosions of virtual war zones, his fingers dancing across the controller with a frantic, rhythmic intensity. The man who had once promised to be her anchor was now a ghost she lived with, a stranger whose only communication consisted of sharp, irritable grunts and requests for more gaming credits or high-speed fiber-optic upgrades. The physical toll on Naga was becoming impossible to hide, the dark circles beneath her eyes echoing the hollow ache in her chest as she realized that her rescue of Kofi had resulted in her own isolation. She would lie on her side of the bed, the mattress vibrating with the haptic feedback of his controller, feeling like a passenger in her own marriage. The intimacy they had once shared felt like a distant, historical event, something that had happened to two different people in a different lifetime. When she tried to touch him, to remind him of her presence, he would shrug her off with a calculated coldness, claiming that her clinging was making him lose focus on the game. He had mastered the art of making her feel like an intruder in the space she paid for, a nuisance who was interrupting the only joy he had left in this lonely, capitalist wasteland. Naga began to internalize his critiques, wondering if she had indeed become too demanding, too focused on the transactional nature of their life. She spent her breaks at the hospital scrolling through their old messages from Accra, trying to reconcile the poetic soul who had written them with the silent, glowing-eyed specter who now shared her pillow. She was a nurse who spent her days saving lives. Yet she felt utterly powerless to resuscitate the dying heart of her own home, never suspecting that the silence she was fighting wasn't a symptom of his struggle, but the sound of his success in erasing her. The financial foundation Naga had spent a decade building began to crack with the sound of 1,000 small digital cuts, as the joint account she had so trustingly opened became a playground for Kofi's startup ambitions. It started with small discrepancies, $50 here for networking, $100 there for market research, but quickly escalated into a series of large, unexplained withdrawals that Naga only discovered during a frantic late-night review of her bank statements. When she confronted Kofi, her voice trembling with the weight of her 60-hour work weeks, he met her with a masterful display of righteous indignation. He didn't offer receipts or explanations. Instead, he offered a sermon on the limitations of the Western mind and the lack of vision that plagued American women. He painted her concern as a lack of faith in his masculine capability, suggesting that her questioning was a form of financial abuse designed to keep him subservient. He spoke of a major land acquisition back in Ghana, a deal that would supposedly secure their retirement and prove to her family once, and for all that he was a man of substance. He used her own desire for security against her, turning his theft into a strategic investment for their future. And Naga, desperate to avoid another week of his cold, punishing silence, eventually apologized for even asking. The gaslighting was so seamless, so culturally nuanced, that Naga began to doubt her own mathematical reality, convincing herself that her exhaustion was making her paranoid. She watched as her savings for a down payment on a larger house vanished, replaced by Kofi's increasingly expensive tastes in clothing and electronics. He began to carry himself with a new, arrogant confidence, a man who had successfully trained his provider to stop asking questions. He would spend hours on his phone in the kitchen, his voice dropping to a low, conspiratorial whisper whenever Naga walked into the room, only to snap back into a role of doting husband the moment he needed another transfer. The phantom expense wasn't just the money, it was the cost of Naga's self-worth, which was being sold off in increments every time she chose to believe his lies over her own eyes. She found herself taking on-call shifts on her only days off, her body breaking under the physical strain of funding a lifestyle she wasn't even allowed to enjoy. She was the engine of their American dream, but Kofi had taken the wheel, and he was driving them toward a destination Naga couldn't see, fueled by the very blood, sweat, and tears she poured into the oncology ward every single night. By the 15th month of their union, the emotional vacuum in Naga's house had become a physical presence, a cold, suffocating weight that sat in the corners of every room. Kofi had ceased to perform the role of the lover entirely, retreating into a shell of cultural melancholy that served as a perfect shield against any form of accountability. He no longer asked about her day, no longer noticed the new scrubs she bought to hide her weight loss, and no longer made any effort to integrate into the life she had built for him in Houston. He was a ghost who only materialized when the Wi-Fi was slow, or when the fridge was empty of the specific, expensive Ghanaian delicacies he now demanded. Naga would find herself sitting at the dining table, staring at the empty seat across from her, while the sounds of digital gunfire and shouted "Ga" from the bedroom reminded her that she was technically not alone. The psychological erosion was reaching its zenith. She felt like a ghost in her own narrative, a secondary character in a play about a man who was struggling to survive the very luxury she provided for him. She began to feel a profound sense of shame, avoiding her friends and family because she couldn't bring herself to admit that the African king she had brought home was actually a silent, glowing-eyed stranger. The isolation was a deliberate tactic, a way for Kofi to ensure that Naga had no outside perspective to challenge the reality he had manufactured for her. He had successfully cut her off from Sarah and her other coworkers by subtly criticizing their Western values and suggesting they were trying to poison her mind against him. Left with only his voice and the silence of the house, Naga's sense of reality began to warp. She started to believe that his distance was her fault, that if she were more beautiful, more patient, or more supportive of his business deals, he would return to the man he was in Accra. She spent her few free moments researching how to support an immigrant spouse, looking for answers in books and blogs while the answer was sitting 10 feet away from her, laughing into a PlayStation headset. The tragedy of Naga's situation was her own empathy. She was a woman trained to see the pain in others and try to heal it, and Kofi had presented himself as the ultimate patient. She didn't realize that in the oncology of her relationship, he was the cancer, slowly metastasizing through her bank accounts and her soul, while she continued to provide the very life support he was using to build a world that had no room for her. The climax of the financial scam arrived on a rainy Tuesday evening, framed not as a request, but as a divine opportunity that would supposedly change their lives forever. Kofi approached Naga with a humility she hadn't seen in months, his voice thick with a calculated, tremulous hope as he spoke of a final investment in a massive government infrastructure project back in Ghana. He claimed that through his connections, he had secured a stake in a development that would yield a payout in the hundreds of thousands, more than enough to pay off Naga's mortgage and allow them to retire early. He only needed $50,000, the very last of Naga's emergency savings and the remainder of her 401k loan capacity, to close the deal and secure the title deeds. He showed her forged documents on his laptop, impressive-looking spreadsheets and letters with official government seals that he had spent weeks perfecting. He knelt at her feet, taking her hands in his, and looked up at her with eyes that seemed to hold all the love of their first weeks in Accra. "This is it, Naga," he whispered. "The end of our struggle. One last push and we are free." The pressure was immense, a psychological pincer move that combined the promise of a future with the threat of losing everything they had built. Kofi made it clear that if she didn't provide the funds, the previous investments would be lost, and his honor back home would be destroyed. He turned the decision into a test of her love, a final trial to see if she truly believed in him as her husband. Naga felt a cold pit of dread in her stomach, a primal instinct screaming at her that something was wrong, but the decades of social conditioning to be a good woman, and the terrifying fear of admitting she had been scammed for 2 years pushed her toward the cliff. She looked at the man she had sacrificed everything for, the man who had her name tattooed on his arm, a tattoo she had paid for, and she chose to believe the lie one last time. She initiated the transfers, watching the numbers in her bank account plummet to zero with a feeling of profound, nauseating vertigo. As the confirmation screen flickered on her laptop, Kofi's demeanor changed instantly. The humility vanished, replaced by a sharp, vibrating energy. He didn't thank her. He simply picked up his phone and walked into the bedroom, closing the door behind him. Naga sat alone in the dark kitchen, the sound of the rain against the window sounding like the counting of coins she would never see again. In the days following the final investment, a strange and unsettling clarity began to bloom in the back of Naga's mind, a nurse's intuition that had spent years detecting the subtle symptoms of a body in decline, finally turning its gaze toward her own life. She noticed the micro-symptoms of the lie, the way Kofi's business calls now sounded more like celebrations than negotiations, the way he had stopped even pretending to look for work in Houston, and the chilling ease with which he now ignored her presence. At the hospital, she found herself staring at the monitors, her mind drawing parallels between the erratic heartbeats of her patients and the erratic patterns of her own household. She began to notice the inconsistencies in his stories, the way the government official he was dealing with seemed to change names, and the way the land deeds never actually arrived in the mail. A cold, hard knot of suspicion was forming in her chest, a weight that no amount of his gaslighting could dissolve. She realized with a sudden and terrifying certainty that she had been providing palliative care to a relationship that was already dead, keeping the body alive with her own lifeblood while the man inside was already planning his departure. The suspicion turned into a quiet, focused investigation. Naga began to keep a mental log of his vampire hours, noting that he was most active on the PlayStation during the hours when it was morning in West Africa. She noticed that he had changed the passcode on his phone, and that he now slept with it tucked inside his pillowcase, a level of security that went beyond simple privacy. One afternoon, while she was supposedly at work but had returned early due to a double booking, she saw him through the window of their living room. He wasn't the brooding, depressed immigrant he played for her. He was standing in the middle of the room, dancing to highlife music, talking animatedly into a Bluetooth earpiece with a look of pure, unadulterated joy on his face. The moment he saw her car pull into the driveway, his entire persona shifted, the smile vanished, his shoulders slumped, and by the time she walked through the front door, he was back on the couch, staring at the television with a look of staged exhaustion. It was a performance, Naga realized, a meticulously crafted role designed to elicit her pity and her purse. The nurse in her knew that when a patient stops responding to treatment, you have to look for the underlying cause. She decided that she would no longer be the one being observed. She would be the one doing the watching. The moment of discovery came not in a grand confrontation, but in the quiet, clinical stillness of a Tuesday at 2, 00 a.m. Naga had returned early from a grueling shift, her soul weary from the passing of a long-term patient, and she had entered the house with the silence of a shadow, her rubber-soled clogs making no sound on the hardwood floors. The house was dark, save for the rhythmic, pulsing blue light emanating from the bedroom door, a light that felt like the glow of a radioactive isotope. She paused in the hallway, her heart hammering a frantic, uneven rhythm against her ribs. She expected to hear the usual sounds of virtual combat, the explosions and the frantic clicking of the controller. Instead, the room was eerily quiet, save for the low, intimate murmur of Kofi's voice. It wasn't the voice he used with her. It wasn't the voice of the grateful husband or the brooding immigrant. It was a voice she hadn't heard since the first weeks in Accra, vibrant, passionate, and thick with a genuine, unforced affection. She leaned against the doorframe, her breath hitching in her throat, as she realized he was speaking into the PlayStation headset, his voice projected into a party that had nothing to do with gaming. She stood there for what felt like an eternity, the sterile smell of the hospital still clinging to her skin, while the man she had mortgaged her life for spoke to someone 6,000 miles away. He was lying on their matrimonial bed, the very bed Naga had worked 300 hours of overtime to pay for, his silhouette framed by the flickering screen. He was speaking in Twi, but the tone was universal, the language of a man talking to the woman he truly loved. Naga felt a strange, icy detachment wash over her, a professional numbness she usually reserved for delivering bad news to grieving families. She realized that the PlayStation party was his sanctuary, the one place where he felt safe enough to drop the mask because he assumed Naga was safely tucked away in the oncology ward, surrounded by the dying. She reached out and slowly, silently pushed the door open an inch further, her eyes fixing on the glowing headset. She wasn't just a nurse anymore. She was a witness to her own execution. The midnight wake-up wasn't just a moment of consciousness. It was the moment Naga realized that the man in the bed was a stranger, and the life she had built was a house of cards built on a foundation of red dust and digital lies. Naga moved like a ghost across the plush carpet she had bought to comfort his feet, her shadow merging with the blue flickers of the TV screen. Kofi was so immersed in his conversation, so intoxicated by the success of his final score, that he didn't hear her until she was standing directly over him. She could hear the tinny, high-pitched voice of a woman coming through the headset, a voice that sounded remarkably like the sister she had seen in the videos from Accra. Kofi was laughing, a deep, genuine sound that felt like a knife to Naga's heart. "I'm telling you, be patient, my love," he said in English, perhaps to practice the language of his future life. "The nurse, she is a fool, she just sent the final 50. The land deal money is already in the hidden account. Naga will pay the final one, the legal fees for my permanent residency, and then I am done with this cold city. She thinks she is my queen, but she is just the ATM. Once the money enters and the green card is in my hand, I will bring you over as my fiancé. We will have the house, the car, and her 401k to start our life. Just wait for me, Amma. I am doing this all for us." The room seemed to tilt on its axis, the air growing thin as Naga absorbed the sheer, calculated cruelty of his words. He spoke of her as if she were a piece of equipment, a resource to be depleted and discarded. He didn't just want her money. He wanted her future, her security, and her very identity to fund a life with the woman he had actually left his heart with. Naga reached out, and with a strength born of a decade of lifting patience, ripped the headset from his head. The silence that followed was deafening. Kofi scrambled back against the headboard, his face a mask of sudden, panicked terror, the blue light of the screen highlighting the sweat on his brow. The woman's voice was still chirping from the discarded headset on the floor, calling his name, "Kofi, Kofi, what is happening?" Naga didn't scream. She didn't cry. She simply looked at him with the cold, diagnostic eyes of a woman who had seen the worst of humanity and survived it. "The final one has been paid, Kofi," she said, her voice a low, vibrating hum of pure steel. "But it wasn't the money. It was my silence, and that just ran out." The aftermath was not a cinematic explosion, but a cold, clinical dismantling of the life Kofi had attempted to steal. Within an hour, Naga had called the police, reporting a domestic disturbance and financial fraud, her nurse's voice calm and authoritative as she detailed the systematic theft of her savings. She watched with a grim, hollow satisfaction as the man who had called her a fool was led out of her house in handcuffs, his African king persona collapsing into a pathetic, whimpering mess of pleas and excuses. He tried to reach for her one last time, invoking the love they had shared in Accra, but Naga simply stepped back, the space between them now as wide and cold as the Atlantic. She didn't see a husband. She saw a parasite that had finally been excised. As the police cruiser pulled away, the blue and red lights reflecting off the windows of the home she had almost lost, Naga walked back inside and began the long, agonizing process of reclaiming her territory. She went to the bedroom, picked up the PlayStation 5, the gift of distraction that had ultimately saved her, and walked it out to the driveway. With a single, deliberate motion, she smashed it against the concrete, the plastic shattering into 1,000 pieces that glittered like diamonds in the moonlight. The cold awakening was the realization that while she had lost her money, she had found her soul again. She spent the rest of the night in her kitchen, the same place where she had initiated the final investment. But this time she was on the phone with her bank's fraud department and an immigration lawyer. She was no longer the provider or the savior. She was a woman who had survived a high-stakes psychological war. As the sun began to rise over Houston, casting a pale, honest light over the suburbs, Naga sat on her porch with a cup of black coffee. She was broke, her retirement was gone, and her heart was a landscape of scar tissue, but she was free. She looked at the red dust on her shoes, a lingering souvenir from Accra, and she kicked them off, leaving them on the porch as she walked back inside her house. She had brought a man from Africa thinking it was love, only to find out it was a scam, but in the end, the only person she had truly rescued was herself. The oncology nurse went to bed, and for the first time in 2 years, she slept a deep, dreamless sleep, undisturbed by the blue light of a ghost. 20 chapters of betrayal, one cold awakening. If you think you'd see the signs, wait until you hear how this ends. Drop a red flag in the comments and subscribe to see exactly how I took my life back. This is the ghost in the console. Stay sharp.